History remembers George S. Patton for a single, brutal slap that nearly ended his career. They call him a bully, a heartless tyrant, an ivory-tower monster who lacked empathy for the men he commanded. But they have buried the record of a frozen Sicilian night when the critics were nowhere to be found. While the world was busy painting a caricature of a volatile madman, Patton was actually plunging into a lethal torrential river during a catastrophic storm. He wasn't giving orders from the back. He wasn't safe in a warm bunker. He was risking instant hypothermia to personally haul a stranded, half-dead private from a watery grave. Today, we conduct a forensic audit of the night Patton risked everything for a man he didn't even know, because in the Third Army, no one was left behind, not even when the general had to do the saving himself. In the summer of 1943, the island of Sicily was a furnace of heat and violence. To the American public, General George Patton was a hero, a conqueror moving with a speed that baffled the Wehrmacht. But behind the scenes, a different narrative was being constructed. Following the infamous slapping of two soldiers in a field hospital, the press and the high command began to view Patton as a liability. They saw a man who demanded perfection but possessed no soul. They saw the polished helmet, the ivory-handled revolvers, and the harsh discipline. And they decided that Patton was a man who loved war more than he loved his soldiers. This caricature was convenient. It was easy to understand. But it missed the fundamental truth of Patton's leadership. Patton didn't demand perfection because he was cruel. He demanded it because he knew that in war, anything less than perfection resulted in a body bag. He saw his army as a single organism, and his devotion to that organism was obsessive. The world saw a general who slapped a soldier for what he perceived as cowardice, but they ignored the general who would walk into a literal flood to reward bravery or save a life. The night in question began not with the sound of artillery, but with the roar of a Mediterranean storm. In Sicily, when the rain comes, it doesn't just fall at attacks. The dry riverbeds, known as arroyos, can turn into raging torrents in a matter of minutes. On this specific night, Patton's convoy was moving through the rugged interior of the island. The visibility was near zero. The mud was deep enough to swallow a jeep, and the wind was cold enough to sap the strength from the strongest man. As the convoy reached a bridge crossing a normally shallow river, they found the crossing completely submerged. The water was a black, swirling mass of debris and death. It was in this chaos that Patton noticed something. A single American truck had been swept off the road and was now wedged against a cluster of rocks in the middle of the river. Inside the cab, a young private was clinging to the steering wheel, his eyes wide with the realization that the water was rising faster than any help could arrive. The soldiers on the bank were frozen. They were looking at a lethal current that would sweep a man away in seconds. The water was ice-cold, fed by the mountain runoff, and the threat of hypothermia was immediate. To jump into that river was a suicide mission. The officers present were looking for ropes, looking for equipment, looking for a way to follow protocol. They were acting like a bureaucracy in the middle of a tragedy. But Patton didn't look for a rope. He didn't ask for a volunteer. He didn't check the manuals for the correct procedure for river rescue. He looked at the drowning man, and then he looked at the water. In his mind, there was no gap between the two. There was no rank in that moment. There was only a commander and his soldier. Patton knew that if he waited for a rescue team, he would be recovering a corpse. Patton stripped off his heavy overcoat. He didn't take off his helmet with its 3 silver stars. He didn't unstrap his revolvers. He simply plunged into the black water. The impact of the cold was likely like a physical blow to the heart. At his age and in that temperature, the risk of cardiac arrest or instant muscle paralysis was extreme. But Patton began to wade and then swim into the center of the torrent. Witnesses described the scene as something out of a fever dream. The most famous and feared general in the U.S. Army was being tossed around like a rag doll by a Sicilian river. He was fighting the current, his boots filling with water, his lungs burning from the exertion. He reached the truck and grabbed the door handle, fighting the pressure of the water to pull it open. He reached inside and grabbed the private, a man who was so paralyzed by fear and cold that he couldn't move on his own. The struggle to get back to the bank was a forensic miracle of sheer willpower. Patton had the private draped over his shoulder, one arm locked around the man's chest, the other clawing at the muddy bottom and the rocks. Every time the current tried to pull them under, Patton dug in. He wasn't a young man. He was a veteran of decades of service, carrying old wounds and the weight of an entire campaign on his shoulders. When he finally reached the shallow water near the bank, his own soldiers had to reach in and haul both men out. Patton collapsed into the mud, gasping for air, his skin blue from the onset of hypothermia. He was shivering so violently that he couldn't speak, but as the medics rushed toward him, Patton gestured toward the private. He didn't want the warmth. He didn't want the dry blankets. He wanted to make sure the man he had just saved was still breathing. The next morning, Patton was back in his uniform. He was back to being the old blood and guts that the world knew. He didn't write a report about the rescue. He didn't ask for a medal. In fact, he rarely ever spoke of it again. To Patton, saving that private wasn't an act of heroism, it was a duty. It was the price he paid for the right to lead. He believed that if he expected his men to die for him, he had to be willing to die for them. This is the part of the story that the ivory-tower critics in Washington chose to ignore. They preferred the story of the slap because it allowed them to judge a man they didn't understand. They wanted a villain, and Patton gave them the perfect image. But the private who was pulled from that river knew a different Patton. The men of the Third Army who watched their general risk his life in the mud knew a different Patton. They knew that behind the volatility and the harsh words was a man who saw every single soldier as his own blood. We have to ask ourselves why history prefers the caricature over the reality. Why do we remember the moments a leader fails their temper, but forget the moments they risk their life for the lowest-ranking person under their command? It is because justice is easier to sell than nuance. It is easier to point at a thaphead and call it tyranny than it is to look at a frozen river and call it love. Patton was a man of extremes. He was capable of great anger, but he was also capable of a type of devotion that modern leadership can barely comprehend. He didn't lead through a system. He led through a soul. He understood that the bond between a commander and his troops is not written in a manual, it is forged in the moments when the general gets his hands dirty, his clothes wet, and his heart cold. The forensic audit of George S. Patton reveals a man who was fundamentally misunderstood by the people who stood the furthest away from him. The closer you got to the front lines, the more the caricature dissolved. On the front lines, You didn't see a bully, you saw a man who would stand in the sleet, who would walk through the minefields, and who would jump into a lethal river, because a single American life was worth more than his own dignity or safety. In the end, Patton's legacy isn't defined by the slap. It is defined by the outcome. He built an army that believed it was invincible because they knew their leader was as savage in his protection of them as he was in his destruction of the enemy. He proved that true leadership is the willingness to be the first one in the water and the last one out. What can we learn from those 10 agonizing seconds in the Sicilian current? We learn that character is what a man does when the cameras aren't rolling and the critics aren't watching. Patton didn't save that man for the press wasn't there. He didn't do it for his career, it actually put his career at risk. He did it because his code demanded it. He understood that you cannot ask for the ultimate sacrifice from men if you are not willing to make it yourself. He moved beyond the slap and into the realm of true heroism, a place where rank disappears and only the human spirit remains. Patton was a warrior, but more than that, he was a guardian. And on that frozen night, he reminded the world that the greatest weapon in any army isn't a tank or a gun, it's a general who refuses to let a single one of his boys go down without a fight. The liberation of the human spirit requires leaders who are willing to face the unbearable truth of their own mortality. Patton saw the truth in that river. He saw that he was just a man, capable of freezing, capable of drowning, and capable of failing. But he also saw that by choosing to act, he could overcome that failure. History will always debate George Patton. They will argue about his mouth, his temper, and his ego. But they cannot argue with the man he pulled from the water. They cannot argue with the thousands of soldiers who followed him because they knew he would wade through hell to bring them home. That is the final verdict of the forensic audit. Patton was a savage, yes, but he was a savage who belonged to his men. What do you think? Does an act of selfless heroism like this erase a moment of volatile cruelty? Or are they both just two sides of the same complicated coin? Drop your honest opinion in the comments. If you want to see the history that the textbooks are too afraid to tell, hit that subscribe button. Because we are just getting started with the secrets of the men who shaped our world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next investigation.